So let's get started with the substance of our event today. We are living at a turning point in human history, the moment when we need to re-envision our industrial society. We know that the cumulative effects of our fossil fuel economy threaten the fundamental systems of our planet, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the climate. And they also threaten our economy and the sustainability of our economy. The good news is that major advances in technology and the dramatic drop in the price of renewable energy make the scale of change necessary within our grasp. The bad news is that we're not moving nearly fast enough to make that change. To tell you more about the future of the planet, it is my great pleasure to introduce Tzeporah Berman this afternoon. Tzeporah has been designing environmental campaigns and working on environmental policy in Canada and beyond Canada for more than 20 years. She is a strategic advisor to a number of First Nations, environmental organizations, and philanthropic foundations on climate and energy issues, as well as an adjunct professor at York University. She is the former co-director of Greenpeace International's Global Climate and Energy Program and co-founder of the NGO Forest Ethics. Tzeporah is Canadian ambassador for World Future Council Global 100% RE, Renewable Energy, a fellow of the Broadbent Institute, and Planet in Focus's 2014 Canada Eco Hero. Just this year, she was listed as one of the 35 most influential women in British Columbia by BC Business Magazine and awarded the Brescia Women's College Lifetime Leadership Award. Her first book is called This Crazy Time, Living Our Environmental Challenge. And I'm going to go a bit political science-y on you. I think the reason that Tzeporah has been so successful in the environmental movement is that she has been a strategic innovator. She was one of a handful of people who introduced civil disobedience on a large scale in protecting Canadian wilderness. She was, again, one of a small group who envisioned and launched a strategy of bypassing governments and using markets to pressure individual companies privately, using private markets to reduce companies' environmental footprints. And most recently, she has been one of a group that has recognized the need to reinvigorate, to return to the grassroots and electoral democracy in a very sophisticated way for the environmental movement. So I think she's absolutely the right person for us to ask what's next. I'm also proud to call her a fellow UBC alumna, as she was awarded an honorary doctorate by UBC in 2013, and I'm proud to call her a friend as well. Please join me in welcoming Tzeporah Berman.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, and it's a real honor to be here on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations and to celebrate with you UBC's 100th anniversary. I think UBC has an enormous amount to be proud of today. From the very first graduating class of 1916, which I found when I was thinking about this speech yesterday, 17 of the 40 people who graduated in 1916, the first graduating class, were women. And that means they started coming to school here at UBC before women even had the right to vote. UBC introduced the Native Indian Teachers Education Program in 1974. UBC was the first Canadian university to adopt a sustainability policy, adhering to its 2007 Kyoto emissions reduction targets, adopting quite ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets, let alone, of course, the incredible technological breakthroughs and research that has been done at UBC over the years. And Dr. William Rees's ecological footprint analysis, wherever I go internationally, people talk about that and use that as a basis for understanding today's sustainability challenges. So all of this made me reflect on how can UBC play a leadership role in the next 100 years regarding the fate of our planet? And I will return to this question throughout my talk today. So also thinking about today, thinking about the next 100 years, I forced myself to sit down and think about what the world will look like in 100 years. Of course, there are many factors affecting the future of our planet. It's a was rather a broad challenge to talk to you about the future of our planet in 30 minutes. It was, but I think nothing will affect the future of our planet more than climate change. Science has proven that our society's fossil fuel use is wreaking havoc on the planet. You know, we can debate these issues all we want, pipelines and politics and whether or not to protest. But the real truth of this issue is the atmosphere just simply doesn't negotiate. This is in part just physics. And carbon that we've been emitting as a result of our industrial society for many years now, from coal, from oil, from gas, is being trapped in the atmosphere. And we can now understand exactly how much is trapped, and we can understand the impact that carbon and other greenhouse gases that is blanketing the Earth, literally blanketing the Earth, we understand now what kind of impact it's having. In fact, when I started looking at the modeling and projections to prepare for this talk, what struck me most is that reports that I was looking at 10 years ago, 15 years ago, were wrong because they were too conservative. The impacts that we're seeing today as a result of climate change are much greater than we predicted 10 years ago. So to be frank, after reading many UN, World Bank, and IEA reports over the years, I thought it wouldn't be too difficult to put together an image for you of the planet 100 years from now. But honestly, even I wasn't prepared for what I was going to find. So I found that at current rates of fossil fuel emissions in 100 years, this university will be a very different place. There will be few music programs. There will be few literature programs. In fact, the university will be much smaller, if it will exist at all, if we allow current rates of fossil fuel emissions to continue. So why do I say that? Because in a world struggling to survive, a world in which I found the conservative predictions say that the frequency and severity of violent storms in 100 years will be 70 to 80% more frequent, more intense. I think that what would happen is that we'll all be focused on survival. It'll be a world in which food production has decreased in most countries in Africa and Asia between 50 and 75%. It'll be a world in which, for the majority of the planet, water scarcity is the norm, where 1 in 6 of the world's species face extinction, 70% of the world's plants. Several scientists, when faced with making predictions given current rates of fossil fuel emissions, said that the models show a 5 to 6 degree warming of the planet within 100 years. They say that it simply means it will be an uninhabitable world. A 5-degree increase, as predicted to occur by 2100 at current rates of emissions, would cause widespread flooding, famine, drought, and mass extinctions. I found little on what would happen to the world's oceans at 6 degrees. So I emailed some of the scientists at the US National Atmospheric Administration. They told me that as a result of absorbing carbon dioxide into our oceans are already 30% more acidic today than they were in the 1950s, and that at 6 degrees, their models are showing oceans that are 150% more acidic. According to NOAA, photosynthetic algae and seagrasses may benefit from higher CO2 conditions in the ocean, as they require CO2 to live, just like plants on land. However, the same isn't true for species such as oysters, such as clams, sea urchins, shallow water corals, deep sea corals, and plankton. What does this mean? According to NOAA, when shelled organisms are at risk, the entire food web is at risk of collapse. That's what we see in a 6-degree world. This year, it was reported that we experienced a dramatic increase in refugees. In fact, it was, of course, a major issue of debate around the world. How do we deal with this dramatic increase in refugees that we're seeing? 60 million people this year. The most commonly cited estimate of total climate migrants is about 200 million by 2050, according to the International Organization of Migration. And some reports, in fact, say that by 2100, we'll have 1 billion climate refugees. Simultaneously, by 2050, let alone 2100, the Food and Agriculture Organization estimates food production will plummet in Europe, many parts of Asia, and Africa by 50%. Food costs globally are expected to skyrocket. A December study from the International Food Policy Research Institute shows that global warming may further increase the price of corn, wheat, rice by at least 2/3 by 2050. We saw this already. Between 2006 and 2008, world average food prices rose by 217% for most grains. In that 2-year period, and many studies show that it was a result of droughts in grain-producing regions that were the leading cause for this world food price crisis, which led, as we know, to food riots, to political unrest. While prices dropped again the following year, thank goodness, the overall trends are not good, and grains worldwide have doubled in price since the year 2000. So all of it made me think, how can we study the arts when we're battling wildfires and storms? Can we focus on perfecting a concerto when food costs have tripled and there are brawls in the grocery store over the last of the bottled water? But of course, this is not simply a concern for 100 years from now. There are no schools open in Fort McMurray right now. There won't be for some time. In India, universities are closed this month because people are collapsing in the streets from record heat. Not 100 years from today, but today. We now know that more people lose their homes due to climate change than war globally today. We know that major storms have increased 50% already since 1970. My family's here today, and when I look at my sons, I want them to know that I have done everything that I can to ensure that they have the choices that we had. I hope when they go to university, UBC, I'd prefer, Quinn, that they have every opportunity that we did. That if they want to study music or literature, that they have that opportunity. That our society is not so focused on adapting to climate change that their opportunities are reduced, that their world is narrowed. You know, a couple of years ago when accepting my honorary doctorate here at UBC, I told a story of a conversation I had had with my grandmother before she died. She reminded me that when she was my age, there were no computers, there were no televisions, there were no cell phones, there was no Raspberry, she said, that you're always holding, talking about my BlackBerry. She reminded me that even as an adult, when she was raising her children, my mother, she never knew anyone who had ever been on a plane. She reminded me of the change that's possible in our lifetimes. So today, as we reflect on the next 100 years, I want to remind you both of change that will happen if we fail to act on climate change, and how that will impact the way future students, our children, our grandchildren will live, how it will impact our economy, our food systems, our politics, and our lives. You know, when I started working on environmental issues as a first-year student at university, these were environmental issues. You know, they were, I started working on these issues because of a passion for wild ecosystems, for big trees and bears. Today, these are no longer environmental issues. They are the moral challenge of our age. They're economic issues, they're food system issues, they're social justice issues. They're even, our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, once acknowledged that climate change is the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. Of course, a year later, when the polls are different, he also referred to Kyoto as a socialist plot designed to suck money out of good people. But at one point, he did say it was the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. But it was this attitude from our previous government that puts us in the situation that we're in today. So what are we doing about this in Canada? How do we address these issues? Well, as many of you know, the history now, thank goodness, is that the former government had a vision of Canada being a global energy superpower. And they wanted to do that by investing as heavily as we could in fossil fuels, in oil and gas. The result is that Canada's emissions rose instead of decreased. The result is that we are way off track to doing what I call Canada's fair share, to meeting Canada's targets to address these issues. So the challenge in front of us is great. In order to facilitate that vision, we needed more pipelines across the country because we wanted to have 9 million barrels a day of oil coming from the oil sands. We currently produce about 2 million barrels a day. And here, actually, in my opinion, is where the good news started. And so, for the record, thank you, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, because he said that these pipelines would be nation building. And in fact, he was right. You see, climate is mostly invisible, especially in places where we're lucky enough not to be experiencing the impacts as severely as other places around the world. But pipelines are tangible. They're a near-term threat. They woke up communities across this country to our oil dependence and the choices that we have to make as a nation. And in fact, they woke us up to the fact that there are critical moments in history where we have to take a stand. Well, background music, I didn't even plan that, but it was kind of good at the critical moment in history. And take a stand we did across the country. I've been working on these issues for 25 years, and I have never seen the engagement that we've seen in the last 2 years. Tens of thousands of people marching in the street, the number of times. At this protest, I remember in Montreal, this was Quebec City specifically, I ended up marching beside an elderly woman. She told me she was 82 years old, and this was her first protest. And she was there with her trench coat and her handbag and her sign, and it's inspiring to me. I have marched with scientists, academics, I have marched with teachers, I have marched with politicians, across the country, from Northern Ontario to Montreal to Ottawa, to here in Vancouver last week. We see people standing up in Fort McMurray, marching through the oil sands. In Prince Rupert, I love this one because I think that might be all of Prince Rupert, actually. So I think that it has been nation building, and it's had a huge effect. In fact, I think it had a huge effect on the last election when Canadians voted for change. And we got a government that is committed to act. We got a government that is committed to turn around on climate change, that went to Paris saying, no, we need a higher level of ambition. We need to do more. We need to support Indigenous peoples. We need to support funding for emerging economies so they can leap over the fossil fuel era. A government that has committed to a new national climate strategy by the fall, to carbon pricing, to clean technology, to reforming the environmental assessment process, to recognizing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We are in the midst of a game-changing moment in Canada because we need those policy changes. Too much in the past, we just talked about our own lifestyles, and our lifestyle is important. But we are not going to address these issues with better light bulbs. We need better laws. And we're starting to get them. I think that the Alberta Climate Plan announced in October of this year is absolutely game-changing. And of course it's because for the first time in 44 years we have a new administration in Alberta, in Edmonton. We have a progressive majority government. And of course that's why, in fact, we have a new climate plan in Alberta, but that's not just why. Because what happened in Alberta, standing beside the Premier, are oil companies supporting a carbon tax, supporting an emissions limit on the oil sands, which I actually believe is the first keep it in the ground legislation, because that emission limit means that even though we've approved 7.2 million barrels per day of oil sands to be developed, under that emissions limit with current technology, we can't develop more than about 4. So this is a government that has essentially mothballed, with current technology, a huge amount of permits that were already permitted. And why did the oil sands companies support that? They supported it because they couldn't move without it. They can't get a pipeline built. They can't get a mine built. There has been so much protest. I sat with some of those oil sands CEOs and said, we now understand that we need greater social license. One of them said to me, I mean, it just doesn't stop. There's Paris, and then there's the Pope, and then there's Neil Young, and we're on the wrong side of this. Right. So how does an oil company get on the right side of it? In part, by supporting progressive policies. Why? Sure, they want better press, but also because a high carbon price stimulates new technologies. It ensures that they can do the investment to reduce emissions. And that's what they want to do. They have a goal of reducing emissions to such an extent that they'll become the preferred source of oil, even if we use less oil by 2050. You know, well, more power to them. But the fact is, the result is, because they were standing on the stage, the Premier passed a policy that phases out coal, that puts in place a carbon tax, an emissions limit, and a renewable energy standard. That is groundbreaking. I think the really good news is that it really is possible today to make the changes that we need to make. We are actually living a tipping point moment in history where we're re-envisioning the world. So yes, there are massive challenges, but what an exciting moment to be living. So since 2004, the annual, this is the good news part, by the way, so you can take a deep breath. Since 2004, the annual investment in renewable energy capacity has increased by more than 700%. In fact, globally, we are now seeing more investment in renewable energy for electricity generation than oil, coal, and nuclear combined. The price of renewables is plummeting. Utility-scale solar PV down 82% since 2009. Wind energy, 61% since 2009. So what that means is that those technologies can now compete with fossil fuels. That we don't actually, by the way, Premier Christy Clark, if you're ever going to see any of this, we don't actually need significant investment in gas because we can leap over that moment now. We have the potential to have renewable energy at scale. And, you know, let's remember, it's not just about climate change. It is safer. It's distributed energy more people can benefit from. I mean, what is a solar spill? It's a really sunny day. So we're seeing major technological breakthroughs. In fact, many people say more breakthroughs in the last 2 years than we've seen in the last 20. So what have we seen? We're now seeing prices plummet and breakthroughs on thin film solar. This year, major breakthroughs in efficiency and costs. Soon we won't need panels on the roof because the buildings themselves, the windows, will have solar technology that produce the energy. In fact, of course, we already have many communities around the world that are not only producing their own energy, like here in Germany, but in fact feeding the grid and feeding the rest of the country. This is a concentrated solar plant in Spain. It feeds all of the electricity needs for 250,000 homes every day. You know, 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, renewable energy was, you know, the pipe dream of some of us West Coast hippies. But now, in fact, we can do it at scale, and we're seeing it around the world. And of course, not just around the world. Here in Canada, this is an incredible community in Alberta that has stored solar thermal heat. So 90% of the heating through the cold Alberta winter comes from solar in this community. Closer to home, we have some incredible examples. Sewage-based district heat. I have to ride over that bridge all the time and it's not smelly. And transportation, of course, is being transformed. Here in Vancouver, 100,000 members already in the last couple of years in car sharing, bike lanes going through the roof. Most of the next generation, my nieces and nephews and son sitting in the front row, probably won't own a car because they won't need one. And of course, the city of Vancouver has been leading this charge, committing to go 100% renewable. I think, in fact, that there is good news everywhere. I haven't even talked about the breakthroughs we've seen in electric cars, prices going down 400%, dramatic increases in how many people are buying electric cars. There's a great stat I found out. Sorry, in China last year, electric car consumption went up 400%, and globally 60%. So here's just a little smattering of good news from the last couple of weeks. The World Bank announced 73 countries and more than 1,000 companies and investors support a price on carbon. China and the US have signed a landmark climate deal. This was actually last year, but I think it's so important it has to be in here, committing to drastically reduce emissions and scale up renewable energy. China's coal consumption has dropped for the first time in the last couple of years. Saudi Arabia announced that it was going to get off oil and decarbonize its economy. The Netherlands announced a plan to ban the purchase of fossil fuel cars by 2025. 2 days ago, the company Total announced that they were pulling out of Arctic drilling and Canadian oil sands due to the 2-degree safety goal committed to in Paris, the first oil company to acknowledge that their future depends on us aligning our projects and plans with that 2-degree goal. Okay, so I could go on, but I want to return in the end here to the role of what the university can do. So how can UBC play a leadership role in the next 100 years regarding the fate of our planet? Of course, through research and technology, continuing to walk the talk, reducing our own emissions, the integration of Indigenous knowledge in these issues, encouraging policy debates, encouraging professors to engage in those debates, encouraging professors to be bold, to stand at the front of those marches. Because there are moments in history when our politicians fail us, where the societal change that is required is so large, such a big shift, that it requires us all to stand up, to get out of our comfort zones. We saw this with civil rights, with women's right to vote. We're seeing it, and it's true today, on climate change, and of course the reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. In Canada, these issues are deeply entwined. Those that have benefited from our current energy system don't want to let go. And to be clear, we can't afford them to just walk away. While I think it is important that we stand up, that we take bold actions, I also think it's important that we create a new narrative on climate change, one that is based on forgiveness. Because we need all hands on deck. We need those engineers who work in the oil sands. We need those folks who work in fossil fuel industries. Because let's be clear, when those people trained and got jobs in the oil sands, they didn't know what we know today. We are all dependent, to a certain extent, on the fossil fuel economy today, and we need to work together for the change. We need to forgive ourselves and those that work in the industries and develop a common purpose. We need to create a new narrative about how do we work together now that we know what we know. So how do we use less? How do we diversify our economy? How do we make sure Canada not only does our fair share but thrives? Our own governments will have to be pushed and pulled. Our own financial institutions will have to be pushed and pulled to act quick enough that our kids have the choices that we have. I hope here in British Columbia and in Ottawa, our governments will listen to the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations and others when they tell us of the impacts of the existing oil facilities right here at home in Burrard Inlet. And they tell us and they warn us of the devastation if we allow the massive expansion of oil tankers off our coast. These are hard issues to talk about, and change is never easy. Our governments need to hear from us, all of us. We need to publish groundbreaking policy papers, engage in civil society debates, and march in the streets. We need to lead by example And if we're going to ensure that 100 years from now, we can look back at this moment in history and know that as an institution, UBC did more than just study it. That, in fact, we had the courage to act. That we had a courage to chart a course to inspire our young people who attend this university, to show them what it will take to act boldly in ways that is commensurate with the scale of the challenge. That we showed them that we're committing to building a clean economy. If we are going to do that, and UBC is going to commit to creating a healthy planet and playing a leadership role in one of the greatest challenges of our age, then the university will have to reconsider its decision to divest. Years ago, abolitionists were told that abolishing slavery would destroy the economy. Suffragettes were told giving women the right to vote would destroy politics. We're told by some today that divesting from fossil fuels is too risky for the university's portfolio. Yet we know that for several years now, there are major fossil fuel funds that are doing as good and some better than funds with fossil fuels. We know today that $3.4 trillion in investment have already committed to divest, that billions of dollars have done it successfully. 518 institutions have already committed to divest in the past 3 years. Georgetown University, the City of Copenhagen, San Francisco, London School of Economics, Stockholm University, Syracuse. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund has committed to divest $50 billion. Several reports have found now that fossil-free funds have equivalent returns to including fossil fuel investments. Some of these reports are saying that the impact of screening for coal and carbon is far less significant than skeptics have presumed. Anyone on an endowment board facing that decision should do this type of investment math. That we now know that divestment from fossil fuels does not necessarily need to incur more risk. Partial divestment is immediately feasible. Some say immediate full divestment is not yet feasible, but that's why faculty, students, and staff here at the university are all calling for divestment over a 5-year period. The UBC's proposed Sustainable Futures Fund is not the answer, I'm afraid. It's only 0.7% of the UBC's endowment, and the requirements for the fund allow fossil fuel companies. Let's be clear, Exxon is neither low carbon nor a sustainable company. We know the risk is not too great to threaten the financial viability of the university because these fossil fuel-free funds exist. Others are successfully doing it. And we know that only 6% of UBC's endowment is in fossil fuels. I've read the evaluation that was done for the Finance Committee on divestment. I think it was surprising for this institution that the report did not consider the extensive research on this topic, let alone include any primary research tracking the returns of fossil-free funds. UBC's own academic experts were not drawn upon to produce the report or recommendations. No consultations were held. And the committee refused to meet with professors and students working on this issue. I'm sorry, I know I'm kind of like the person invited to a cocktail party who starts talking about climate change, and there's a part of my upbringing that feels like this is really rude, but I think that it's a moment in history where we can't speak out on these issues. We can't not speak out on these issues. I think we have to inspire our students by our actions. We have to show them how seriously we take these issues. So let's commit to being an institution that inspires leadership. As an alumni today, I want to say that I am signing the UBC 350 pledge on divestment. I'll be sending my donation to them until UBC commits to divest from fossil fuels. We need to be an institution that for the next 100 years is part of leading the solution, creating, discovering new ground, and challenging other universities to step up to the plate. Because this moment in history is a moment when we need all hands on deck, a moment when we know we have the technology to make the changes that we need, a moment when we know that we have the economic stability, the political stability to lead as a nation. The challenge in front of us is significant. Our own former Bank of Canada, now the governor of the Bank of England, has said that the vast majority of fossil fuels are unburnable if we're going to keep the climate safe. Why does he say that? Because we now know that the atmosphere can simply only hold so much. The global total carbon budget is 790 gigatons. We have already used 515 gigatons. So what does that mean for us visual learners? It means that if fossil fuel emissions are greater than the pink bar, we will not have a safe planet. I did a lecture similar to this in Alberta a couple of years ago, and I had this man at this point just stand up in the audience and say, "Are you crazy? You want us to keep it in the ground? We could make a killing on what's out there." We could make a killing. We don't need to make a killing. We need to make a living. We need to figure out how to create a safe economy, an economy that is safe for our children, a planet that allows them to have all of the opportunities that we have. Canada will move to a low-carbon economy. We will move by design or by default. This is Atham Steiner, the head of the UN Environment Program, saying there's no question, because every economy will move that way. If we allow it to be done by default, if we don't plan it, there will be more casualties. It will be more difficult. Canada will be behind the rest of the world. So our job as educators, as leaders, as voters, as parents, as citizens, is to encourage that change, to make sure our elected officials know it's a priority, to act according to our beliefs and not just by changing our consumption or lifestyle. We need to invest and vote for the world we want. So what's missing today, if we have all this technology and financial change? I think what's often missing is courage. Moments of change require us to step up, to challenge the status quo. They require us to act, and that will inspire others to act. That's what leadership is. It's having the courage to not just study it, to not just talk about it, but to act. A couple of days ago, I was in Washington at a North American carbon pricing forum. Many of the participants were Republicans. And the buzz in the room was all about Canada and the turnaround on climate policy. I heard more than one person say, well, if Alberta can do it, I suppose we can do it. That's the great thing about courage. Courage is contagious. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tzeporah. The courage to make a living rather than a killing, I think, is a good thing for us to bear in mind. We've got lots of questions that have been posted online, and so I'll start with the top one. There's a few variants of this, but people are interested in hearing what your experience was on the BC Climate Leadership Team and how Premier Christy Clark reacted to your recommendations.
So I was appointed by the Premier a year ago to the BC Climate Leadership Team with 15 other people to redesign British Columbia's climate and energy policy. And this was done, so literally a year ago, last May, we were told, she wanted Climate 2.0, something to announce in Paris. And trying to figure out how British Columbia can get back on track to meeting our climate targets is not an easy task. We had economists, many people from the business industry, the gas industry, First Nations, mayors, all around the table. And the first thing was to really hear, we got the presentations from all the staff on where we're at. And I don't know if many people realize, but British Columbia has been an incredible leader on climate change with bringing in the first economy-wide carbon tax in North America in 2008. But the government froze that carbon tax from increasing a couple of years ago, and simultaneously our emissions have been going up because of the investment in gas. And so the result is British Columbia's emissions over the last 2 years have been going up. In fact, while Ontario, if you look at the graphs, Ontario's emissions, Quebec's emissions going down. We're doing quite well in a lot of places across the country. Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia going up. And so how do we square that circle? How do we get the emissions back on track to going down when the government told us in no uncertain terms that they were going to be developing gas and LNG industry? So we had to model that in. In the end, we put together a package of recommendations that we think will mean that British Columbia becomes a leader again, committing to a strategy and a goal, 30% by 2030 of zero-emission vehicles, committing to a strategy for the gas industry, making sure that they also have to pay the carbon price for all emissions, and putting in regulations on methane. What that would mean was that the gas industry, both upstream and downstream, would have to electrify. It'll cost them more, so they have to use renewable energy. It's still a compromise, but we were able to model British Columbia going back down and meeting its targets if we increased the carbon price by $10 a year. And in fact, the polling shows that 70% of British Columbia is like tax. They know it's working, they're proud of it, etc. But unfortunately, we tabled our recommendations before Paris. The Premier went and lauded our recommendations in Paris as being very exciting. It's been 6 months, and not a single one of them have been adopted or accepted yet. So I'm not sure what the Premier thinks about our recommendations. I'm not getting a lot of calls lately. A week ago, I and several other members of the climate leadership team put out a press release condemning the government for not acting so far on our recommendations. And I hear they're going to come out with a new package in June of some of the recommendations. But so far, they're refusing to move on unfreezing the carbon tax, which is essential. If we don't increase the cost to pollute, we will not meet our emissions reduction targets. So I think that's the thing to look for in June when they do announce a new climate plan.
Thank you. Well, we've got a couple of questions with a bullet about divestment. Combine them again, but generally, what do you think needs to be done next in terms of encouraging UBC to divest?
Well, I hope they'll just decide now, because just kidding. I think it's really important for the president and the board to be hearing from all of you who agree that we should be divesting. I think that the group on campus, UBC350, the students and alumni and faculty who are working on that organization are doing a great job. They deserve our support as they try and raise this issue with the university. These are not easy issues to address. That's true. But I think it's time for the university to rethink what they're doing. And I think I want to give a shout out to the folks at UBC who I understand, UBC350, who I understood hung a banner a couple minutes before my talk here on campus. I think we need to be doing everything we can to raising awareness, and I think that probably means pressuring the administration. And it also means those of you on the inside having the tough conversations to try and figure out how to move forward.
Thanks. We will have an opportunity to take at least one question from the old school way if people want to raise their hands. I'm guessing there are folks here with a microphone that they can bring to you. So someone in the back row there, there's someone behind you with a microphone. Could you please introduce yourself?
Hi, my name's Alex Hemingway. I'm actually one of those folks who are working on the fossil fuel divestment campaign, and I want to thank you very much for that shout out today, Tzeporah, and for everything you said in your talk. It's the support of alumni like you really means a whole lot to us. And one other quick thing I'll note beyond thanking you is that we're hoping after the end of the talk to chat to folks as they're leaving, tell them more about the campaign. We hope to have our canvassers in the building. Unfortunately, they were asked to leave, but you can find us outside of the building to chat further. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Alex.
I'm going to go back to the tablet. How do we get developing countries on side in terms of global progress and negotiations?
I would say that emerging economies are on side. I think we've seen some tremendous changes in the policies, at Paris. Paris was an entire turnaround for China, and I understand from some colleagues in China this week that the government is starting conversations about phasing out coal. That's a really big deal in China, and there are some reports coming out just last week that they are already looking at, not building any more coal plants, but what it will take to phase out coal. I would say a year ago I would have sat up here and said, it's a big problem because population is growing so quickly, economies are going so quickly, they keep saying they need all the energy. When I was working internationally, I remember being in Durban at the UN conference and meeting with some of the NGO community from China and India, and they were saying, but renewable energy is going through the roof, but we need it all. We need nuclear, we need, et cetera. And now that attitude is starting to shift. The price drop, especially in solar, is having a dramatic effect on emerging economies. But I think how we get them more on side is through more money into the Green Fund. That's the bottom line. I mean, it's a fascinating thing to be at these conferences and to have, countries from Africa or India or China, just turn to you and say, well, that's not our pollution up there. This is not our problem right now, right? You created this problem, so why are we paying for it? We're only just starting. And so there's this kind of equity conversation, right? And that's why both Canada and the US have really led the way in Paris to committing billions of dollars for the Green Fund to help emerging economies kind of leapfrog over the fossil fuel era. And we now have technology sharing agreements as well, which is helping a lot. So I'm feeling quite positive about the opportunity in Marrakesh for emerging economies to make even more commitments.
I cried when I saw the news that the U.S. and China had reached that agreement a year ago.
It's a game changer.
Okay, so we've only got time for two more. I'm going to ask one from the screen, and then we'll turn to one from the audience. A fun one has emerged. What would you say to President Donald Trump?
Oh, no. Wow.
2016.
That's right. So I suppose my tact would be the same that I'm taking when I meet with a lot of the oil company CEOs right now in some ways. Because when I moved back to Canada 4 years ago and started meeting with oil sands companies, I had a lot of conversations, literally about climate change, whether it's happening or not. Like I felt like after working internationally for a couple of years, it felt like I was going back several decades when I sat down with them. And so the approach that I took was to bring forward to them economic reports from the IMF on decarbonization and why it's essential, the business case from the Commission on Environment and Economy, the Pentagon report on security. That had a tremendous impact on some of the oil and pipeline CEOs I was working with. And I had this one game-changing moment where one CEO turned to me and he said, so what I find fascinating is on no other issue do I ever, as a CEO, because my job is to project trends in the future, I never surround myself with people who agree with me. And I didn't realize until these meetings that that's what I was doing on climate change. And so it was a fascinating kind of like a moment where he had a turnaround. And I think, Donald Trump, you would have to focus on the business case as well. Because now that exists. We know that it will cost more. In fact, the IEA now, the International Energy Agency now predicts that for every dollar we don't spend on renewable energy and low carbon development, we will spend 4 in 20 years. Because it's going to cost us more. Because the price of adaptation, I mean, those floods and fires are not cheap. And so they calculate the price of adaptation. It's expensive to not act on climate change. So there are many benefits, the economic benefits that now the kind of business community, and I think that's part of what was turning those Republicans around at that carbon pricing conference I was at in Washington last week. I think, that could turn them around, but I don't know. When I think about Donald Trump, I just can't. I can't breathe. So I have no more words. That's it.
Last question. Anyone in the audience want to find the microphone? Yes, there is someone in blue here. A microphone's coming to you so that we can record it.
There's a woman in red who really wanted to ask a question too. So I don't know if we can get her after.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Helen Mendez. And I'm so proud, Tzeporah, that you are working on our behalf on this issue. It gives me tremendous confidence. What would you say
Thank you.
to a room full of people whose jobs depend on the energy sector? And I mean people who don't have all that many alternatives. They're not necessarily, they're not university graduates. They're not, they depend on those jobs and they don't really have many alternatives. I think that's clear enough.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of people like that, I think, who are reluctant to let go of the energy sector and the people who support it and the politicians who support it because they depend on it in such a very fundamental way.
I have had a number of those conversations over the last couple of years because I'm doing a lot of work in Alberta right now. And I think, so what I've been saying is it's really important to have the conversations on the inside and on the outside. That no one expects you, to quit today. Let's be clear, right now our society does depend in part on oil. So the question is, how can we work together to ensure that you have retraining opportunities, that there are new jobs, that there are new policies that reduce our dependence on fossil fuels? So there was a group of oil sands workers that approached me a couple of years ago, and they were trying to figure this out. And they were terrified, really. And and these are young guys. They've got families. They've got kids. They've got, they're like, I don't know what to do. It's not a great work environment for them. They don't actually like their jobs. Many of them, 6 weeks on, 6 weeks off. It's quite toxic. All these other things. And so I encouraged them to start having conversations in the lunchrooms and to be talking to their companies. It was rough at the beginning. One of them got kicked off his job site, lost his job. He had to fight it through the unions, got his job back for talking about renewable energy in the lunchroom. And then they banded together and they formed an organization. So I encourage people, I find them so inspiring. The organization is ironandearth.org, Oil Sands Workers for Renewable Energy. These are men and women who currently work in the oil sands, who are creating a conversation about renewable energy and who are now calling on the government for retraining programs. And so I think that is the way to approach it. I mean, we have to stop pointing fingers entirely, especially at the individuals who work in the industries. We need their knowledge base. We need to work to transform our economy. Though it doesn't mean we don't call people to account. CEO of Exxon, I think it's okay to point your finger, but my point is we have to call people out for inaction. I did last week with the Premier of British Columbia. I think we have to. But we have to stop creating a narrative that excludes hundreds of thousands of people that currently work in the fossil fuel industry, especially in Canada, especially in Alberta. I mean, Alberta's economy is about 67, 68% dependent on fossil fuels. It's not going to change overnight. But we have to change now. So we need all voices calling for that change from the inside and the out.
Thank you. I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions. I hope that you will all join me in thanking Tzeporah for a presentation that was hopeful. And I really like this idea of moving to a narrative of forgiveness and collaboration, because it's not the energy industry, it's the oil and gas industry. And there are other forms of energy that we need to turn our attention to. Okay. So thank you so much.
Thank you.